Leaving ideology and meta-history, let's return to the history of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev was elected to be General Secretary in 1985 following the death of Chernenko. Gorbachev had been Andropov's favored successor to usher in reform to the stagnating Soviet system. He, of course, did not directly succeed Andropov as Andropov would have wished, but ultimately he did, because after Chernenko's rapid death and the death of 3 general secretaries in just as many years, the Politburo wanted to have somebody younger, and so they turned to their youngest member, a 54-year-old Gorbachev, to leave the country. Gorbachev was not a radical reformer, I would say, out of the gate. The first reforms that Gorbachev enacted were restrictions upon alcohol. Alcoholism had long been a scourge of Russian society at this point. The Soviets attempted 3 times to have anti-alcohol campaigns, with the third and furthest reaching campaign occurring now during Gorbachev's premiership. While this campaign was not a full-on prohibition, it did enact laws which limited sales in stores to a certain amount of inconvenient hours for people, and it also raised the price of alcoholic drinks. The result was a massive decline in wine and beer output, and it cost the opposite of what you would have wanted. A shift towards the use of vodka, cognac, and other spirits which could be more readily manufactured and traded through the black market. The shift away from beer and wine towards hard liquor meant that the alcohol that was being consumed was more likely to be more powerful and would make the effects of alcoholism worse. Outside of traditional spirits, bootleg alcohol would be made out of things like windshield cleaner and cleaning alcohol, which resulted in people dying. Vodka was also a key source of tax revenue within the socialist system itself, and when it was banned, it deprived the Soviet Union of that key tax revenue, and it kind of really hurt their economy. And this was one of the things that would hurt their economy going forward with the economic catastrophe that was perestroika. In 1989, it's believed that ending this tax on alcohol deprived the state of 91.8 million rubles. I shouldn't say ending the tax. Withholding this consumption that could be taxed, I should say, would be a better way to say it. But anyway, it deprived the state of 91.8 million rubles of revenue out of an income of some 459 million rubles. In 1990, this program would be discontinued, but a lot of damage had been done by that point. When Gorbachev came to power in 1985, he was surrounded by many ministers and Politburo members who had entrenched power bases. Gorbachev would need to carefully sidestep them and to contain those who would have been more critical of the radical reforms he intended in the years to come. And so he was pretty cautious at the beginning, and he worked towards only having moderate reforms and being able to kind of put the people that would have been critical of him in their place before he can move on to more radical reforms. It always takes a leader years to cement power behind themselves, but with Gorbachev, I think that he was gifted with a certain series of crises which allowed him to do this faster than most leaders are ever capable of doing it, and to a much higher and more thorough amount than many other leaders. And just one of the things that really helped him, again, was he was 54 and most of the other members of the Politburo were older than him. So even without the crises, he could also age them out. Andrei Gromyko had been foreign minister since 1957, and had essentially guided the entirety of Soviet foreign policy without the input of anybody else as the general secretary who'd be capable enough to push him in any other direction. And so he kind of just ran it on his own from Brezhnev's stroke from 1975 onwards. Gorbachev was able to replace him with Eduard. I'm suck at this Georgian name. Eduard Shevardnadze in 1985, and that was only a few months after taking power. Gorbachev still had to keep Gromyko in the Politburo, though, when he did this. You got to remember that Khrushchev had been removed from power as general secretary in 1964 by other Politburo members that didn't like him, and so he was forced into retirement. And Gorbachev knew that he could be removed from power, so he had to be really cautious. Ultimately, that didn't happen to Gorbachev, and Gromyko was dead by 1989. And by that point in time, many other members of this high governing party had also passed away. So Gorbachev was really able to just replace them with his own men as they naturally faded away, and that helped him cement his own power. I think what's more important, though, than this natural aging process were two separate crises which Gorbachev exploited brilliantly. While I do think Gorbachev is a shit man of history, if you will, he is very good at maneuvering within the Soviet system. He's a very good politician, even if he's a shit man of history that kind of is this fulcrum point of an individual in charge of failure. He was not without his talents, and he really knew how to exploit a crisis in order to gain political capital from it. So this first crisis was the Chernobyl disaster, the most infamous, not just nuclear disaster, but perhaps environmental disaster in human history. And that happened pretty early on because he became General Secretary in March of 85, and so by the time of April 26, 1986, Reactor 4 of Chernobyl explodes. This was from a faulty design, and Reactor 4 exploded and irradiated much of the nearby town Pripyat, and the authorities ultimately had to evacuate this large swath of land in northern Ukraine and southern Belarus, which became the exclusion zone. The news media controlled by the authoritarian Soviet government did not initially tell the public how severe the incident that happened at Chernobyl was, but it did not really react at all. It didn't really react enough to protect the citizens from radiation exposure. While the town of Pripyat was evacuated the next day, the central government didn't really acknowledge to the general public what had happened until April 28th. So that was 2 days later. Many Soviet citizens who didn't already trust their government were turning to radio programs from Eastern Europe and Western Europe to know the scale of what had occurred. Nuclear technology has always been subject to a lot of unfounded fear and extreme exaggeration in its dangers, but the public all over Europe kind of took on to this exaggeration, and it kind of got out of control. It ended up in not millions, but tens of thousands of Western European women ultimately had abortions, and when asked why they did so, elective abortions, and said that they were afraid of the Soviet radiation from Chernobyl causing their children to have birth defects. So you have this problem where the Soviet media is viewed as untrustworthy because it's not saying what's happening at the time, maybe even to calm the Soviet people, but it backfires because the Soviet people are turning to the Western media, which is often anti-nuclear for political reasons, like the German Green Party, and they're just completely out of control and exaggerating the supposed danger of nuclear power and nuclear technology. And that's just kind of making the system worse and making the Soviet people distrust the government even more than they ought to. This wasn't really helped by the massive scale of what the Soviet Union did to curtail the problem of Chernobyl. Having such a huge area of an exclusion zone really didn't help. I mean, in retrospect, we now know that you could probably just live in the exclusion zone, that all the Soviet estimates, let alone like European Green Movement's estimates about the damage from Chernobyl, isn't just exaggerated. It's like it's like an order of magnitude exaggerated. But these like massive movements that they're doing, and that they're having like everything is fine guys kind of media presence going on where you can't question it because there's no open media, it really undermined the legitimacy of the government. The effects of the Chernobyl disaster were not immediately apparent, I think, at that time, but Gorbachev himself has retroactively said that the disaster is what caused him personally to lose faith in the Soviet system as it had existed to that point in time. I think when he's saying that, what he's talking about is this culture of lying, which the Soviet media and the Soviet system just kind of relies on to overcome its shortcomings. And when you're talking about the industrial system of over-exaggerating quotas, that's one thing. I mean, it got to the point where the central government of the Soviet Union is using spy satellites, military spy satellites, right, to measure wheat harvests in Central Asia because of how unreliable the lower downs are in exaggerating output. But when it's a lot worse when you're talking about lying about this perceived disaster that these scientists are exaggerating and saying puts the whole human race into danger from radiation. And the problem here is you have a big problem economically when you're talking about, Uzbek wheat. But what ended up happening is that this culture of lying and this culture of sweeping problems or minor issues under the rug is what caused this graphite thing. Because what happened is that what stopped the spike leading to a nuclear explosion that was going out of control was this graphite tipped mechanism. I'm not a nuclear scientist, but what stops the reactor from going out of control is this graphite tipped mechanism. But the graphite caused the reaction to amplify. And so this faulty mechanism got swept under the rug during this culture of lying. And so the very culture of lying and within the Soviet industrial system is what could be said to have led into the Chernobyl disaster. That disaster was the greatest in the Soviet Union since the famine of 1946, 1945, the post-war famine after World War II when America withdrew its food subsidies. This shook Soviet confidence in their system, I think, across the board. And the Soviet confidence in their government and public trust was just on a downward spiral as Gorbachev began to liberalize the system. And as Gorbachev's liberalization destroyed the economy, it just kept spiraling and spiraling out of control. And Gorbachev used Chernobyl and this limited sharing of information due to the top-down nature of the Soviet media apparatus to push for liberalization of the media and free speech, and that's what became Glasnost. The influence of Chernobyl upon the collapse of the Soviet Union and Gorbachev's movement towards liberalism and social democracy, though, outside of these kind of like retroactive stuff. It's like, that's when I lost hope in the Soviet Union and I lost hope in the system, right? These, 2020 hindsight comments from Gorbachev, it's a little difficult to directly chart. But there is an incident that he exploited, which is a lot more, one-to-one direct in how it allowed Gorbachev to get a free hand in changing up the Soviet government system and shaking up the higher echelons of power towards what he wanted them to be. And so this incident occurred on May 28th, 1987, where a West German pilot, commercial pilot, flew a small private plane. The name of the pilot was Matthias Rust, and he flew from Helsinki, Finland, into Moscow. And he would ultimately land this small plane on a bridge just outside of the Kremlin, in Moscow. And so this was like God wanted this to happen or something. This was such a unique incident, or black swan incident, because this incident occurred on Border Guards Day. It was like this public holiday that the Soviet Union had where they would celebrate the border guards, and so that meant that the border guards in the country and the total border security, most of it was off on holiday. But further than that though, both civilian and military air traffic controllers detected this flight, but they did nothing to intercept or prevent Rust from doing what he was doing. But with the Border Guard Day kind of thing, there are outside factors, like special historical factors, that let Rust and being able to do what he did. In 1983, there was the Korean Airlines disaster, Flight 007, if you will. And this was a flight that went to New York, stopped in Anchorage, and was going to end up in Seoul. And what it did along the way is it went over on accident over Soviet airspace. And this is September 1st, 1983. And the Soviet air defenses ended up shooting down the civilian airliner and killed 246 passengers and 23 crew. This was one of the most major events in terms of people actually dying in the Cold War. And it was occurring at a very intense period during the Cold War, the early Reagan period before Gorbachev came to power after the intervention in Afghanistan. There was several incidents that occurred in this period. There was, of course, the Able Archer incident of military planning by NATO, causing the Soviets to think that it was some kind of like ruse to have this plan, and that they were faking the planning and the military exercises in order to invade outright the Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact. And there was the American stationing of the Polaris missiles in Western Europe. And there was all this stuff that was going on that was really intensifying the Cold War. And so it kind of contributed to the Soviet Air Force and the Soviet Air Defense Force being so aggressive that they would shoot down the civilian airliner. And it was this horrible disaster in terms of the Soviet Union's public image. And so after that, it's clear that you would see that they would be very reluctant to shoot down any kind of civilian airliner. And so that's what happens in the Rust case. And so ultimately, Rust was able to penetrate into the very core of the Soviet Union itself. Gorbachev proved incredibly decisive immediately upon this incident, and he used it as his casus belli to dismiss numerous Soviet higher officers from duty, effectively allowing him to basically purge the officer corps Stalin style without actually killing anybody. And that meant that the military wasn't able to be this bastion of resistance towards any kind of radical reforms. His dismissals included the Minister of Defense, Sergei Sokolov, Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Air Defense Forces, Alexander Koldenov, and just several others. And this was really I think, the event that made him able to reform the way that he wanted to. Before all this, Gorbachev was making calls to reform the Soviet economy early in his premiership, but after the Rust incident, that allowed him to centralize power and to start the radical reforms that he had wanted. And so he begins the Perestroika, or the rebuilding or restructuring of the Soviet economy. So in July of 1987, the law on state enterprise was passed by the Soviet legislature, the Supreme Soviet, which formally began Perestroika. This law allowed state enterprises to determine their output based on what they believed the demand to be, but it did not allow for market forces to actually take effect because price controls would remain in the economy. The amount of goods manufactured could be lowered or technically increased in accordance with what it was thought would actually be the demand, and state enterprises were then supposed to be self-managed in regards to the cost of manufacturing. So there was this ability to adjust supply, but there was no ability to truly understand what the demand was on a deeper level, or for demand to really adjust in any way in accordance with the supply that was there. So the result was that the amount of goods created purposefully began to decline as manufacturers still didn't have the ability to profit because of the strict price controls. This meant that widespread shortages would begin to pervade the Soviet Union across the board from that point on. And this led to a rapid decline in the standard of living, but also kind of like a full-scale economic collapse and depression as it kept going for years and years without any kind of correction from the Soviet leadership. While the citizens of Soviet Union before had been used to shortages of supplies and rationing, which is endemic to any kind of centralized system, the severe decline in living standards again had not been felt since the famine of 1946, the famine of 1947. The entire post-war period after that point, the Soviet people had seen this ever-increasing rising standard of living. And that's what they had grown accustomed to, and that was what they expected. The decline in the standard of living, which was pretty fierce, then was seen throughout society and added to this decline in popular support for the government. Particularly hard hit during this was the Soviet agricultural sector, which always was notoriously poorly run and ineffective. With this new insane economic climate, food production began to decline and the threat of famine began to emerge again for the first time since that post-World War II famine, when the Soviet system underwent shock when Lend-Lease ended. The Soviet Union had become accustomed in the Brezhnev era to use oil and natural gas to trade directly for hard currency in order to buy food on the international market to pad out the shortcomings of the Soviet agricultural sector. This was this long-time safety valve that they were able to use so that the Soviet economy could keep coasting along. But the United States strategically formed this oil glut during this period to undermine this advantage and cause friction within the Soviet economy, as it engineered a drop of the price of oil internationally. And the reasoning for this is that by the 1980s, advances in oil extraction technology had allowed for offshore drilling to become a real thing and to compete with traditional oil extraction. So oil extraction expanded into the North Sea with Norway and Scotland, and expanded into the Gulf of Mexico. These new discoveries also allowed for an increase of production in nations that were outside of the traditional OPEC nations, which had grown to dominate the oil industry in the first half of the Cold War. Countries such as the United States, the Soviet Union, Brazil, Egypt, India, Malaysia, and Oman began to become real players in the global oil industry. Finally, the United States, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf states had this deeper strategy to deliberately increase their oil output in order to cannibalize their own profits for geopolitical reasons. They did this in order to deprive oil revenue for the hostile nation states towards them. And it wasn't just the Soviet Union, but it's really going to hurt the Soviet Union. It was also towards Islamist Iran after 1979 and Saddam's Iraq that this was geared towards. The thought was that Iraq, this pretty hostile power, which is revisionist, if you deprive their advantage in oil, then they're not going to be as economically capable. Iran, which is this pariah state after the Islamic Revolution in 1979, if you deprive their oil, they're going to be less capable. And indeed, the Soviet Union, with its weakness in its agricultural industry, which it kind of papers over with its oil trade, if you deprive that, then the Soviet Union is going to have real problems. And so the limiting of the Soviets' supply for oil, to trade oil, its ability to do so, was making another famine in the modern Soviet Union a real possibility. And it was something that Gorbachev did not want, and something which the Soviet leadership would do anything to avoid. That the biggest contribution that the United States had towards the collapse of the Soviet Union really is the fostering of this oil glut. The increased military spending of the United States, on the other hand, didn't really have any impact or correlation with the decline of the Soviet Union. I think that that's just mythology that the neoconservative movement uses to justify itself and to justify the United States' own military buildup, both at that time and afterwards. Because the reality of the fact is that the Soviet Union's military buildup was one of the things that helped its economy. Heavy industry, and in particular military industries, have certain advantages under central planning. Indeed, the Soviet Union's economic system resembles the way that most their peacetime economy is very similar to the way that almost all industrial economies end up being run during wartime conditions. While a much larger share of the Soviet economy was taken up by its arms industry than the share of the American economy was taken up by its arms industry, I think that that's kind of a misnomer to say that the American arms industry was really stretching the Soviet economy to its brink. It's kind of the opposite. The American arms industry, it was really specialized in private industries, so you can't really compare private industries with defense contracts. So you can't really compare apples to apples here because they're two completely different systems. Much of the Soviet arms industry, on the other hand, it was dispersed across the Soviet economy, and that the same industry which created arms created civilian goods. And so despite there being a centrally planned system, or despite huge advantages for the civilian structure and people wanting to work in the arms industry in the Soviet Union, and so there was no pushback within the Soviet Union against the arms industry the way that there would be with like the peace lobby in the United States and all that. The reality is that they're just completely difficult, and you can't take them one-to-one and directly compare them, because on paper the Soviet arms industry was a much larger proportion of its total economy. The reality is that the arms industry of the Soviet Union is not just the arms industry, it's the heavy industry of the Soviet Union at large, and a lot of civilian products are being created by the the military industry in a way that they're not in the United States. Part of this has to do with the American peace lobby itself. People get very up in arms with any kind of company investing in the military, and so there's kind of like pressure groups and stuff like that. I know that right now even people are trying to leave Spotify and boycott it because the leader of the company he's involved in the arms industry and he's pro-Israel. And so they're against Spotify, not because of its very extreme negative impact on the music industry and the quality of music which is able to become popular in the United States and the Anglosphere at large. They're against it because its connection to the arms industry. And so the result is that the American arms industry is kind of very... I mean, there's other counterexamples like with, Boeing making civilian airliners, but the reality is the military industry in the United States is very specialized compared to the military industry that was in the Soviet Union. The historians who support this neoconservative and pro-Reagan narrative rely on that false equivalency and that misunderstanding to push their point. It must be stated that the Soviet arms industry was a very popular and very sought-after place for people to work domestically. So there wasn't any interior uproar, to the same extent at least, to any kind of military buildup or allocation of resources in the Soviet Union in the way that there was in the United States domestically. And so the Soviet Union was much more able to absorb the cost over allocation of resources in central planning to its arms industry by just buying consumer goods outright with hard currency when it sold its natural resources and weapons on the international market. So the Soviet Union could just kind of increase its armed industry indefinitely, and it could just kind of eat the cost with natural resources or selling those arms itself to buy food or buy, VHS tape players from other countries. With this oil glut, though, the Soviet Union wasn't able to lose its natural resources to absorb these costs anymore. But it could still do that when it dealt arms. And so, if anything, the oil glut could push a more rational leader than Gorbachev to double down on the arms industry, because that would be an economic way out of the oil glut and the consequences which it's doing for the Soviet economy. Gorbachev was not a very level-minded or rational leader. He was not a pragmatist here. The Soviet Union's occupation and arming of Eastern Europe came at a great cost to the Soviet Union, of course, and much of its international arms shipments to countries outside of the Warsaw Pact were to key allies like Cuba or Vietnam. And so it wasn't that good of an economic enterprise when we speak about the gifting of it to other communist countries. So yes, there is this element that the military buildup is bad or negative on the Soviet economy, but that mostly comes from the need to keep occupying Eastern Europe. When it's able to sell its weapons to non-Eastern Bloc countries for profit, that's beneficial. So what the Soviet Union ultimately does is Gorbachev moves it in this direction of reducing arms shipments and reducing its military across the board without any kind of consideration of this, purely for ideological needs. And that's because he abandoned the Marxist-Leninist idea of class struggle occurring not just within a nation, between the different classes there, but between nations, between the worker states and the capitalist states. And he ideologically moves into like this post-communist, globalist secular humanism, and really gets enmeshed personally in the international peace movement. The law on state enterprise was not the only radical law which changed a lot of stuff in the Soviet Union as part of Perestroika. The law on cooperatives passed in 1988 mirrored the practices of the new economic policy of the 1920s, and that the law allowed for limited private ownership of businesses in some service and light industries. That's the way I wrote it. Anyway, foreign investors were allowed to have joint ventures with Soviet ministries as well under this law. Gorbachev's goal here was to attract investment from Western nations in order to have them integrate in the Soviet economy and to have the Soviet economy integrate with the overall European market. The end of the military buildup in Europe and the occupation of the Warsaw Pact nations was kind of this gamble on Gorbachev's part. He was shutting off his military expenditure for ideological reasons, but there was also this idea that if he cut back on them, even to the third world outside of like gifting it to Eastern Europe, that it would make the Soviet Union a lot more of a place to invest in for the liberal economy of Western Europe. And so he would allow Eastern Europe to liberalize and drop it and allow and kind of incorporate Warsaw Pact into the developing European Union structure. But when reviewing the policies of Perestroika, one must understand that these policies are developed in a country which had a culture of central planning, and due to its socialist ideological education, a lot of people didn't really understand how markets or capitalism were supposed to work and how they should model themselves, say, after the economies of Western Europe. They kind of just had this kind of cargo cult mentality that if they liberalized, they wouldn't need to kind of like guide it there, that it would just kind of work on its own in a kind of cargo cult. And so they didn't really know how to guide the economy into becoming a Western European modern developed economy. And they kind of just did these reforms willy-nilly, and they weren't moving quickly on the reforms either. Once they made them and it was obvious that there was a problem going on, they kind of just kept them and let them get worse and worse. And so these reforms were ill-advised, and they're kind of built on ignorance of economic reality. And a lot of them are pushed for political or ideological goals rather than any kind of realistic understanding of how free market economies really work. The economic policies of Perestroika forced state enterprises to work as if they were a company in a market system which had to sustain itself without allowing that said company to gain profit by setting its own prices. The result was economic devastation. At the same time, the Soviet Union willingly deprived itself of two major forms of revenue, the first being taxation for alcohol, and the second being international arms shipments. And this is at the same time where there's this global oil glut that meant that they couldn't rely on oil or natural gas. The Soviet Union then rapidly bankrupted itself and began to depend upon international shipments of foodstuffs, which they didn't have the resources to buy. Thus, the state risked a created famine, again out of their incompetence. And this attempted economic liberalization, which had been done to increase the Soviet standard of living, was backfiring. We're just going to lean into the reality that Perestroika is going to be compared to China's socialism with Chinese characteristics. It's just inevitable that you're going to end up doing that. The Soviet model was a failure, as we all know, and the Chinese model was an extreme success. I think that perhaps the most important difference when understanding that is that the Chinese were abandoning price controls gradually, and the Chinese were more willing to work and adjust things as things went on, and that they're significantly more pragmatic in what they're doing. And the Soviets, they never abandoned price controls the entire time. The Chinese were far less aggressive in their transition, like I said before, and that transition took over a very long course of time. Well, Gorbachev kind of just pushed everything through in 2 years. While both the Soviet Union and China were capable, as we've seen with the modern Russian Federation, of moving from central planning towards a more market-oriented economy, I think that China's potential for immediate economic growth was a lot greater than that of the Soviet Union. And that has to do with China being much more open to or to Western investment. There's just this natural ability for the West to intervene in China far more than there is with the Soviet Union. And the reasoning for that is that China, that the United States after Nixon was hedging on the Sino-Soviet split between the Soviet Union and China. And so Western investors, if they invested in China, it wasn't a direct threat in the way that the Soviet Union was, especially the Western Europe. Even to this day, even before the invasion of Ukraine, Western Europeans are Russophobic, that there's this natural fear of Russia and that there's this natural fear of the Soviet Union. And so any kind of outside investment in the Soviet system is kind of dead on arrival. And Gorbachev, his plan is kind of like this insane gambit, because he's going to try and abandon Eastern Europe and cut down on his military. And cutting down on his military is going to hurt his own economy, with the idea that if he abandons Eastern Europe and cuts down on his military and deliberately destroys his own military, by the way, outside of the whole arms industry thing, cutting down on his military is a bad idea because the military is a massive employer. If you're this armed camp, you really don't want to cut down on your military very quickly. Even if people are, forcibly enlisted in it, you want to gradually cut back your military, because when you immediately shrink your military, you're laying off hundreds of thousands of people overnight. And so it's just a bad idea, full stop, to shrink your military over a very short period. But his gambit is to abandon Eastern Europe, to trade that for investment from Western Europe. That's his grand strategy. But the problem there, which I've talked about over and over and over again, is that Eastern Europe, because of its cultural proximity, and many of the states which they're controlled in Warsaw Pact by the Soviet Union are Slavic states. And so them moving towards liberalism is going to incentivize and inspire the civilians that are dissidents against the Soviet system within the Soviet Union to act. And by just abandoning Eastern Europe, you're making yourself weak. So Gorbachev really has this gambit of exposing his greatest weakness for something that's not going to happen, because Western Europe, even at its peak, right, in the 2000s, and early Putin, when Western Europe thought that Putin was going to be a real liberal, and Germany's investment in oil and all that, it's still not the amount that Western Europe and that the world invested in China from 1978 on, until it's starting to go down a little bit after COVID and after Xi took power. But there are other reasons outside of that, beyond this kind of Western European fear or American fear and hatred of Russia, that they just don't have for China. The other thing is that China's starting at the bottom as this very agriculturalized society. The Soviet Union of 1987 is already this highly industrialized nation. And while it attempted at autarky, it was still the people in the Soviet Union expected to work industrial jobs. So during the 1980s, in the 70s, Western Europe is going to move towards offshoring its own industry. And Japan too. They're going to move towards that. And the Soviet Union depends on onshore industry, right? That they're this highly industrial place. And their labor just isn't cheap enough in order to offshore stuff into the Soviet Union proper in the same way that it is in China. And so what happens is that after 1991, the Soviet industry that existed when put on the world market, the labor is artificially inflated by the previous Soviet system and kind of shielded by Soviet autarky, like as a kind of super protectionism. And so when that falls down in free trade in the 1990s, the Soviet Union just kind of deindustrializes and collapses. So the investment that did occur in China, with China on the verge of industrialization, allowing all this free labor to be invested in these Western firms and Japanese firms and Singaporean firms and so on in China with their cheap labor, that same cheap labor is not available within the Soviet Union. And so this kind of like export-driven model of industrialization that China jumped on, it just does not apply to the Soviet Union at all. So the Soviet Union's liberalization and the Russian Federation's liberalization and the constituent Soviet states' eventual liberalization, they're just two completely different things. And that Gorbachev could have never done the type of liberation that Deng Xiaoping was able to accomplish. Gorbachev's reforms, despite how thoroughly, or perhaps because of how thoroughly he was able to cement his power, were not conducted cautiously or orderly like the reforms were in Deng Xiaoping's China. They occurred all at once. Right on the track of perestroika came glasnost, or transparency of the government. This meant the establishment of free speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, and the right to assemble and protest. You have to remember, throughout the entire world and throughout all of human history, the clearest thing that's going to result in a government being popular is a well-managed economy. Governments who are perceived as managing their economy well are going to be popular. Even communist governments that are behind the West, like Brezhnev's, if it's growing in some sense and living standards are rising, that's going to make it popular. If you are causing living standards to go down, you're going to be unpopular. That's just the rules of the universe. So the policies of glasnost, they opened up the government for public criticism for the first time in the Soviet Union. This is occurring when they have engineered an economic catastrophe, which is through ignorance, through negligence, through malice. And that's going to open up the leadership of the Soviet Union to be extremely unpopular in a very short course of time. You know, if you liberalized your economy and you caused a depression, well, at least if people couldn't talk about it openly, you could fix it without that intensive criticism. But once you open yourself up to intense criticism, it's just going to spiral out of control, and that's what happened. Those who wanted reform and said that this reform was not enough, they would be bolstered because of freedom of speech. Those minorities that wanted independence, they could point towards the collapsing economy and use it as a way to push for their independence, which they weren't before. And communist hardliners that know this is failing, they now have the ability to criticize the government when they did not before. When Gorbachev's reforms are failing, people couldn't criticize Gorbachev from a communist perspective either. So glasnost did not simply open up the current leadership to criticism, it also opened up the entire history of the Soviet state to criticism. And so every single atrocity that the Soviets ever committed, that was starting to be aired up. And so Gorbachev, despite separating himself from communism, by opening up criticism to the Soviet Union in general through free speech, meant that him as a leader was now going to be connected to the mass killings of Stalin, to the mistreatment of the minorities by the Russian majority, the putting down of the Russian majority on behalf of the minorities, the kind of affirmative action empire stuff, and the collaboration of the Soviet Union with the Axis empires and the Soviet Union's own atrocities during the Second World War. The Soviet leadership in particular was extremely protective of that reality, protective to a fault even of the Catalan massacre. The Soviet Union didn't just bury up the Catalan massacre or didn't allow people to talk about it, say like the Chinese did with the Tiananmen Square. The Catalan massacre is when they just wholesale took prisoners when they invaded Poland in 1939, and they wholesale took prisoners of officers, the Polish officer corps, and just wiped out the entire Polish officer corps. They just killed all of them to colonize Poland. And so, with the Tiananmen Square massacre to this day, China just says it didn't happen, right? Well, the Soviet Union made the situation worse because instead of saying the Catan, I'm saying Catalan, I'm adding an L into it, and I'm mispronouncing, guys. You just gotta know me, by the way, by this point in time. But anyway, the Catan massacre was made worse because the Soviet Union didn't just deny its existence, they blamed it upon their enemy, Germany. So they're at double duty. They're not just obfuscating the truth or even denying, they are making up a false reality to defend their crimes. And the other thing about, the Stalin atrocities and the atrocities of the Civil War and everything is that, unlike with the Holocaust, historians are willing to discuss the extent of what happened and the nature of what happened. But, what the Soviet public got during this time is going to be, fallacious, bits and pieces, exaggerated, the black book of communism tier bad history. And so what Gorbachev did by unleashing Glasnost is that he is pinning this legacy of all these Soviet atrocities which are coming out, the realization of them. I mean, the Soviet people knew in bits and pieces beforehand that there were bad things that happened, obviously, or anecdotally knew. But now there's this explosion of coverage over everything bad that happened since 1917. And so the whole entire economy, or the whole entire perception of the government is going to be tied up with every single atrocity that it ever committed at this time. And so, as Gorbachev is becoming more and more unpopular, unfairly I should say, the shadow of Stalin and the shadow of Lenin and their bad things that they did is going to become his own thing that he has ownership of. And something which he cannot take away. And so the radicals that want to form the system and move it towards true democracy, because Gorbachev is the leader of the country, he represents the Soviet past. And so somebody that's coming up new outside of the system, somebody like Yeltsin, who's an outsider, he's going to represent the future of liberalism. Gorbachev is going to represent the past of communism, all the terrible things. And because his reforms, even if they're, breakneck and undermining the system, Yeltsin selling full-on Western liberalism. And Gorbachev, he's selling half measures, some kind of crypto hybrid communist system where it seems like he's dragging his feet or he's lying to the public, trying to maintain the communist status quo. And so when you are the person that's promising reform and promising change, but you're not going through that change immediately, then you're seen in some sense of being the main block to that change, being what is pulling it back. So we see this with Trump. If Trump doesn't kick out or change the immigration policy immediately and then keep saying he's going to fix illegal immigration and he's going to fix the American immigration system for the nativists contingent, the anti-immigration contingent, and he never goes about it, well then the right-wing critics of Trump, like say Nick Fuentes, they are going to see Trump as this liar that's withholding the real change from them. And so Gorbachev, as time goes on, despite his desire to do these reforms, he's going to be seen as the person that's withholding the reforms. He's going to be painted into the hardliner, into the Stalin figure by the people that want the reforms and who are moving more radically towards the liberal perspective for Russia and the Soviet society at large, especially in minority republics like Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia.